Introduction to the Old Testament, Unit 12, Part 2, From Judge to King. Now we move to the book of Samuel. This is an interesting situation where we have a person by the name of Elkanah, the son of Jehoram. He had two wives. The one had several children. That was Peninnah. And Hannah had none. And this was a burden for Hannah. And it would be a burden for any woman in Israel because their main purpose was to have children. That she is barren. And every year they would go to worship at Shiloh, and they would offer a sacrifice there, and her husband Elkanah would give her a double portion, but Peninnah got hers and some for all of her children. And Hannah was destitute. And so on this occasion, she went to the shrine that was there at Shiloh, and she prayed. Normally, when you prayed, you spoke out loud. But in Hannah's situation, she moved her lips, but there was no sound. Eli, the priest, saw her and accused her of being drunk. She says, "No, not so, my lord," Hannah replied. "I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord." Eli says to her, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him." Now, what she had prayed for is that God would give her a son, and then she would dedicate that son to the ministry of God. And this is what happened. She became pregnant. She gave birth to Samuel, because that means God has heard. She didn't go to Shiloh the next year. She stayed home and she weaned her son. When he was old enough, she took him to Eli at Shiloh and left him there to serve Eli. Now, we've had quite a bit said about Eli and his sons. His sons were wicked. Eli himself wasn't very good because he wasn't preventing his sons from doing the evil things that they were doing. We have several things said about Eli's sons in chapter 2. They were very wicked. They would take meat from those who were offering their sacrifices, and even though it did not follow the pattern, they would give them the meat now. He wants to barbecue it, and if you don't give it to me, I'll take it from you. And then we're told that Eli was very old. He heard everything that his sons were doing. They slept with the women who served at the entrance to the tent of meeting. And he asked them, why did they do those things? Because they were evil. But they wouldn't listen to him. When Samuel came, he became a faithful servant of God. And he served in the temple, served Eli. And then we read that one evening he heard his name called, and he thought it was Eli calling him. So he ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." But it wasn't Eli. The second time Samuel is called, he runs to Eli, and it isn't Eli. A third time he's called, and he runs to Eli. Now Eli recognizes something is happening. So he says, next time you hear your name called, just say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant hears." And so this is what happened. In chapter 3 is where the call of Samuel takes place. And I've mentioned he calls 3 times, and then he calls again. Samuel said in verse 10, "Speak, for your servant is listening." So then God spoke to him. "I am about to do something in Israel that will make the ears of everyone who hears of it tingle. At that time I will carry out against Eli everything I spoke against his family, from beginning to end." Now, the next morning, Samuel is asked by Eli, "What did God tell you?" And so Samuel told him everything, hiding nothing from him. And then Eli said, "He is the Lord. Let him do what is good in his eyes." Even though this is going to bring an end to the family of Eli. And then there is a battle that takes place between the Philistines. They are the arch enemies of Israel. In chapter 4, verse 1, the Israelites camped at Ebenezer and the Philistines at Aphek. And the battle took place, and the Philistines killed about 4,000 Israelites on the battlefield. They want to know why they were defeated. And they said, "What we need to do is to bring the ark of the Lord from Shiloh, so that it may go with us and save us from the hand of our enemies." Now, the ark is supposed to be where the presence of the Lord resides, but they are using it in a way not meant by God. So Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, take the ark to the battlefield. And when they see the ark coming, all of them shout and make a big noise. The Philistines hear it and want to know why all of that is happening. And the Philistines were afraid because they say a god has come into the camp. But they don't want to become slaves of Israelites, and so they decide they are going to fight as much as they can to prevent it. And then it says in verse 10, the Philistines fought, the Israelites were defeated, and every man fled to his tent. The slaughter was very great. Israel lost 30,000 foot soldiers. The ark of God was captured, and Eli's 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, died. Now this was told as a sign that it is God's doing, that those 2 men would die on the same day. Word comes back to where Eli is. He is sitting on a stool, and when he hears that the Israelites had been defeated, his 2 sons were killed, and then the ark was captured. That's too much for him, and he falls over and breaks his neck. Also, the wife of Phinehas is pregnant, and she's about to give birth, and when she hears about the death of her husband and these other events, she gave birth to a son. She named the boy Ichabod, saying, "The glory has departed from Israel because of the capture of the ark of God and the deaths of her father-in-law and her husband." She said, "The glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God has been captured." Ichabod means no glory. Then we have to take care of the ark. The Philistines have it. And it says that they took it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. This is one of their main cities. There are 5 cities. And they put it in Dagon's temple and put it beside Dagon. The next day, when they went into the temple, Dagon was fallen down on his face before the ark. And they put him back in his place. And the next day, he had fallen down again. But this time, his hands had been broken off, and his head was broken and was lying on the threshold. Only his body remained. And it says, that is why to this day, neither the priests of Dagon nor any others who enter Dagon's temple at Ashdod step on the threshold. Later in one of the prophets, it's going to mention those who step over the threshold, which means that they are engaged in the same worship that the Philistines worship. There was also a plague that broke out on the people because of the ark. Then decide they're going to get rid of it from there, and they moved it to Gath. Verse 8. But it says, after they had moved it, the Lord's hand was against that city, throwing it into a great panic. And they had an outbreak of tumors. Now, I had heard a lecture by one of the physicians from the City of Faith when they used to have a hospital at Oral Roberts University, and he mentioned that the tumors, or whatever is left, was for those who survived. Most of them died immediately, but if they were able to come through, they would have these tumors. And so it says that they are going to take it from Gath and they are going to go to Ekron. But when it was entering Ekron, the people don't want it. So they called together the rulers of the Philistines and wanted to know, what should we do? Well, we'd better send it back to Israel. And if we send it back, we need to send along a gift with it. They send 5 golden mice. Now this is an indication of how the plague was spread. The mice are carrying the plague, was sort of like a bubonic plague. And they also send with them copies of the tumors. And so these are put onto a new cart along with the Ark of the Covenant and 2 cows that have just given birth to calves. They determine that if the cows go straight ahead without turning back to where their calves are, then this is the Lord's doing. And this is what happened. It says the cows went straight up toward Beit Shemesh, keeping on the road, lowing as they went. So the Philistines watch to see what takes place. There are men working in the fields, and they see the ark coming, and they are grateful that it has been returned to Israel. They then chopped up the cart and offered the 2 cows as a sacrifice to the Lord. But then we also hear that there were some of the people who looked into the ark. This is in verse 19. God struck down some of the men of Beit Shemesh, putting 70 of them to death, because they had looked into the ark of the Lord. So the people mourned the heavy blow the Lord had dealt them, and they decided they couldn't keep it at Beth Shemesh, and so they sent it on to Kiryat Yearim, saying, the Philistines have returned the ark of the Lord. Come down and take it up to your place. And so this is what happened. The men of Kiryat Yearim came, took up the ark, and it was in Abinadab's house. And Eleazar, his son, was appointed as the guardian. Now this is where the ark stays all during the time of Saul when he was king. So it's a long period of time. And then we read about Samuel. Samuel had gone to Mizpah. In chapter 7, verse 5, Samuel said, "Assemble all Israel at Mizpah, and I will intercede with the Lord for you." And it says that they poured out water as an offering to the Lord, and they fasted, and they confessed. And Samuel was leader of Israel at Mizpah. And then it says when the Philistines heard that they were gathered there, they came against Israel. And Samuel, in verse 9, took a suckling lamb, offered it up as a burnt offering. He cried out to the Lord on Israel's behalf. And while Samuel was sacrificing the burnt offering, the Philistines drew near. But the Lord thundered with loud thunder against the Philistine and threw them into such a panic that they were routed before the Israelites. It says, the men of Israel rushed out of Mizpah, pursued the Philistines, slaughtering them along the way to a point below Beth-kar. And then Samuel took a stone and set it up between Mizpah and Shen and named it Ebenezer. And Ebenezer means stone of help. Thus far has the Lord helped us. So the Philistines were subdued and did not invade Israel territory again. That is during the time of Samuel. Now the people are wanting a king. Now Samuel is serving as a minister of God. He's serving as a priest. He's also serving as a judge, similar to the judges in the book of Judges. But they want someone who was permanent, someone who can lead them in battle, fight their battles for them. And so they come to Samuel and ask for a king. All the elders of Israel, in verse 4, chapter 8, gathered together, came to Samuel at Ramah. They said to him, "You are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have." Now Samuel had appointed two of his sons as judges, and they were at Beersheba. But they took bribes. They were not good. They want a king, and Samuel told them about the ways of a king. But they still insisted on a king. And then God informed Samuel that they really haven't rejected him. They have rejected the Lord. The Lord is to be the one in control. And then we read about the young man named Saul. This is in chapter 9. A Benjamite, a man of standing whose name was Kish, son of Abiel, the son of Zeror, the son of Bechorath, the son of Athiah, of Benjamin, had a son named Saul, an impressive young man without equal among the Israelites, a head taller than any of the others. Now we are used to large men, high or tall men, and so we usually think of Saul as a very tall person. But the average Israelite was probably about 5'6". And so a head taller would make him 6 feet or thereabouts. So he doesn't have to be a giant. Saul was out looking for some animals that had strayed from his father. And they looked for a long time, but they couldn't find any. And so they had decided that they would go home because the father would be anxious about Saul. But the servant who was with Saul says, well, there's a man here, a seer, and he can tell us where to find the animals. And so they went to the town where Samuel lived. They met some girls. This is in verse 11 of chapter 9. Some girls coming out to draw water, and they asked, is the seer here? And they answered, he's ahead of you. Hurry now. He's come to town to offer a sacrifice. Then they caught up with Samuel, and Samuel invited them to participate in the sacrifice that he was making. And in verse 17, we are told, when Samuel caught sight of Saul, the Lord said to him, this is the man I spoke to you about. He will govern my people. So it says that Saul approached Samuel and asked, where is the seer's house? Samuel identified himself, and he mentioned to him that the donkeys you lost 3 days ago, do not worry about them. They have been found. So Saul participates in the sacrifice, and a special part of the meat is given to him. He's an honored guest. The next morning, early, Samuel went outside with Saul, and as they were going down to the edge of the town, Samuel told him to send his servant ahead. And then in chapter 10, verse 1, Samuel took a flask of oil and poured it on Saul's head and kissed him, saying, has not the Lord anointed you leader over his inheritance? When you leave me today, you will meet 2 men near Rachel's tomb at Zelzah on the border of Benjamin. They will say to you, the donkeys you set out to look for have been found, and now your father has stopped thinking about them, is worried about you. He's asking, what shall I do about my son? So then you'll go on from there, and you come to the great tree of Tabor. 3 men going up to God at Bethel will meet you there. One will be carrying 3 young goats, another 3 loaves of bread, and another a skin of wine. They will greet you and offer you 2 loaves of bread, which you will accept from them. And then you will go to Gibeah of God, where there is a Philistine outpost. And you're going to meet a group of prophets. You will also become a prophet. Now, it says, once these signs are fulfilled, do whatever your hand finds to do, for God is with you. Now, Saul is supposed to do something. And there is a Philistine garrison there, and probably he's to attack the Philistine garrison. But Saul left Samuel, and it says God changed Saul's heart, and all these signs were fulfilled that day. And when they arrived at Gibeah, a procession of prophets met him. The Spirit of God came upon him in power, and he joined in their prophesying. When all those who had formerly known him saw him prophesying with the prophets, they asked each other, what is this that has happened to the son of Kish? Is Saul also among the prophets? Now there will be another occasion where Saul prophesies, and the same thing will be said. In verse 14, Saul's uncle asked him and his servant, where have you been? Looking for the donkeys, he said. But when they saw they were not to be found, we went to Samuel. And Saul's uncle said, tell me what Samuel said to you. And Saul should have told him, because this man becomes the head of Saul's army later. Saul replied, he assured us that the donkeys had been found, but he did not tell his uncle what Samuel had said about the kingship. He's supposed to do something to prove to the people that he is capable of being king. Well, then we have another situation where Saul is chosen by the people. Again, Samuel summons the people to Mizpah. He chooses the tribe of Benjamin. And then from the tribe of Benjamin, they go clan by clan. And finally, Saul, son of Kish, was chosen. When they looked for him, he couldn't be found. He was with the baggage. He seems to be a shy fellow at this time. The people shouted, "Long live the king." And then in verse 25, Samuel explained to the people the regulations of the kingship. He wrote them down on a scroll and deposited it before the Lord. Then Samuel dismissed the people, each to his own home. Now Saul still hasn't done anything. So God is going to force upon him an occasion where he will demonstrate he is capable of being king. And this takes place in chapter 11. Nahash the Ammonite went up and besieged Jabesh Gilead. And all the men of Jabesh said to him, "Make a treaty with us, and we will be subject to you." But Nahash the Ammonites replied, "I will make a treaty with you only on the condition that I gouge out the right eye of every one of you, and so bring disgrace on all Israel." Now it's interesting that in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there was a passage found that is not included in the text here. And that is that Nahash had conquered most of the land where Jabesh Gilead is, and only these men who had fled to Jabesh Gilead were left with 2 eyes. And so they are now said, if we can't find help, we will submit to you tomorrow. The messengers came to Gibeah. Saul reported these terms to the people, and they wept aloud. And just then Saul was returning from the fields, and when he heard of this, it says that the power of God came upon him. He burned with anger. He summoned the people of Israel from all of the tribes, and he had 300,000 from the men of Israel, and Judah had 30,000. He crossed over to Jabesh Gilead, divided his men into 3 divisions, and in verse 11 it says that during the last watch of the night they broke into the camp of the Ammonites and slaughtered them until the heat of the day. Those who survived were scattered, so that no 2 of them were left together. And so this confirms then that he has ability to lead the people. Then Samuel has a farewell speech. Now he's old. He is a little perturbed that he had not been chosen as king, but God had informed him, and they weren't rejecting him, they were rejecting God. So he has this farewell speech in chapter 12. He has not taken anything from anyone. He also instructs the people in chapter 12, verse 20, "Do not be afraid. You have done all this evil, yet do not turn away from the Lord, but serve the Lord with all your heart. Do not turn away after useless idols. They can do you no good, nor can they rescue you, because they are useless. And so he encourages them. And then in chapter 13, it says Saul was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned over Israel 42 years. Now, there is no number in the Hebrew text. It just says that he was 1 year old when he became king, and he reigned for 2 years. So this has been supplied from elsewhere. It says that Saul chose 3,000 men from Israel. 2,000 were with him at Michmash and in the hill country of Bethel. 1,000 were with Jonathan at Gibeah of Benjamin. So that's all he has, 3,000 soldiers. In chapter 13, verse 3, Jonathan attacked the Philistine outpost at Gibeah, and the Philistines heard about it. And then Saul had the trumpet blown throughout the land and said, "Let the Hebrews hear." So Saul attacked the Philistine outpost, and Israel has become a stench to the Philistines. And the people were summoned to join Saul at Gilgal. Now Samuel had told him, wait for him for 7 days, and then he would come and offer the sacrifice. But it says that Saul remained at Gilgal, and all the troops with him were quaking with fear. In verse 8, he waited 7 days, the time set by Samuel. Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and Saul's men began to scatter. So he said, "Bring me the burnt offering and the fellowship offerings." And Saul offered up the burnt offerings. And just as he had finished that, Samuel arrived, and Saul went out to greet him. Samuel rebukes Saul for what he has done. It is not his prerogative to offer the sacrifice. That has to be done by the priest. It is not the function of the king. Now, in the ancient Near East, that may have been all right, but in Israel, it was not right. In verse 15, Samuel left Gilgal and went up to Gibeah of Benjamin, and Saul counted the men who were with him. They numbered about 600. Now, because he has offered the sacrifice, he is warned by Samuel that his kingdom will not endure. That's in verse 14 of chapter 13. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him leader of his people, because you have not kept the Lord's command. So this is another step in the downward spiral of Saul. We should mention too, in verse 19 of chapter 13, not a blacksmith could be found in the whole land of Israel, because the Philistines had said, otherwise the Hebrews will make swords or spears. So they had to go to the Philistines to have their plowshares, mattocks, axes, and sickles sharpened. On the day of battle, the Israelites did not have weapons of war. Jonathan had a sword, and Saul had a sword. And then in chapter 14, Jonathan attacks the Philistines. This is at the pass of Michmash. Jonathan goes out and he shows himself to the Philistines who are above him. He's in a valley, and there are two cliffs that stood to the north toward Michmash and the other south towards Gibeah. And so Jonathan says, we'll see what the Philistines say. If they say, stay where you are, we'll stay. If they say, come up here, we'll go up there because God is going to give them into our hands. Both of them showed themselves, and the man of the outpost shouted, "Come up to us and we'll teach you a lesson." So Jonathan climbed up and attacked the Philistines, and he killed 20 men in an area of about half an acre. Panic struck the whole army, and those in the camp and the field, and those in the outposts and raiding parties, and the ground shook. It was a panic sent by God. Notice again, it is God who is doing the fighting. And then Saul asked Ahijah to bring the ark of God, but they didn't take a reading. But Saul went to battle, and they found the Philistines in total confusion. Saul puts an oath upon the men. They are not supposed to eat anything until they have defeated the Philistines. And of course, since they had nothing to eat, this means that they are weak. But in chapter 14, verse 24, they were in distress, but Jonathan finds some honey. And this is in verse 26. He saw the honey oozing out, yet no one put his hand to his mouth because they feared the oath. But Jonathan took some on the end of his staff, and he ate it. And then they told him that there was this oath that they had taken, that they were not to eat anything. And Jonathan said, "It would have been much better if you had eaten." In verse 31, that day after the Israelites had struck down the Philistines from Michmash to Ayalon, they were exhausted. They pounced on the plunder, and taking sheep, cattle, and calves, they butchered them on the ground and ate them together with the blood. And of course, this is no. You're not supposed to eat an undrained animal. And then Saul has a large stone rolled over near him, and then the animals are killed on it. But then he wants to know whether they should go down after the Philistines. And verse 36, but the priest said, "Let's inquire of God." And God did not answer him that day. So somebody has sinned, and so he wants to know who it is. Saul and Jonathan are on one side, and the soldiers are on the other. And Saul and Jonathan are taken. And then Jonathan is singled out as the one who has sinned because he has eaten this honey. Saul is going to kill him, but the people prevent that. And then we have a summary statement. In verse 46, Saul stopped pursuing the Philistines, and they withdrew to their own land. After Saul had assumed rule over Israel, he fought against the enemies on every side: Moab, the Ammonites, Edom, the kings of Zobah, and the Philistines. Wherever he turned, he inflicted punishment on them. He fought valiantly and defeated the Amalekites, delivering Israel from the hands of those who had plundered them. And then we're introduced to the family of Saul. In verse 49 of chapter 14, Saul's sons were Jonathan, Ishvi, and Malchishua. The name of his older daughter was Merab, and that of the younger was Michal. His wife's name was Ahinoam, daughter of Ahimaaz. The name of the commander of Saul's army was Abner, son of Ner, and Ner was Saul's uncle. All the days of Saul there was bitter war with the Philistines, and whenever Saul saw a mighty or brave man, he took him into his service. Now in chapter 15, God rejects Saul as king. He's already said this through Samuel earlier when his line will not continue. Samuel said to Saul in verse 1, I am the one the Lord sent to anoint you king over his people Israel. So listen now to the message from the Lord. This is what the Lord Almighty says. I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when they waylaid them as they came up from Egypt. Now go, attack the Amalekites and totally destroy everything that belongs to them. They are put under the ban. Do not spare them. Put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. So you notice that everything is included. So Saul went to war against the Amalekites, and it had 200 foot soldiers, 10,000 men from Judah. And they went to the city of Amalek, set an ambush. Here they meet the Kenites, and they tell them to leave the Amalekites so that they are not destroyed. So the Kenites moved away from the Amalekites. Saul attacked the Amalekites all the way from Havilah to Shur to the east of Egypt. He took Agag, king of the Amalekites, alive, and all his people he totally destroyed with a sword. But Saul and his army spared Agag and the best of the sheep and cattle, the fat calves and lambs, everything that was good. Now this is a disobedience of the command that he was given. And Saul then is sought by Samuel. He was told that Saul had gone to Carmel to set up a monument in his own honor, and has turned and gone on down to Gilgal. So when Samuel reached Saul, Saul said, "The Lord bless you. I have carried out the Lord's instructions." And Samuel then said, "What then is this bleating of sheep in my ears? What is this lowing of cattle that I hear?" And then Saul gives the excuse that they kept those to sacrifice to the Lord. In verse 22, Samuel replied, "Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the voice of the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king." And then Saul admits that he has sinned, but he wants Samuel to go with him to worship the Lord. And in verse 32, it says, Samuel left for Ramah, but Saul went up to his home in Gibeah of Saul. Until the day Samuel died, he did not go to see Saul again, though Samuel mourned for him, and the Lord was grieved that he had made Saul king over Israel. So David then is anointed by Samuel. That is in chapter 16. He takes an animal with him and goes to the city of Bethlehem and offers the sacrifice. But he talks to the family of David, to the father. There are 8 sons. It says in verse 6, when they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab and thought, "Surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him." And so these 7 sons come before Samuel. None of them is chosen. So Samuel then asked, "Do you have another son?" And yes, there is David. He's out with the sheep. So he is brought in. And it says in verse 12, he was ruddy with a fine appearance and handsome features. Then the Lord said, "Rise and anoint him. He is the one." So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came upon David in power. Samuel then went to Ramah. Then David is taken into the service of Saul. An evil spirit now has come from God and is on Saul. And he becomes very moody when this happens. And if David plays his harp or his lyre before Saul, the music seems to calm Saul. And he does this several times. A couple of times Saul tries to kill David. Chapter 17 is David and Goliath. And most of you are familiar with this. Goliath is a giant who challenges the army of Israel. They have been on opposite hilltops for day after day, and no one goes to fight him. Now it mentions that Goliath was from Gath. The text says in verse 4, he was over 9 feet tall. He probably is not that tall. When David killed him and cut off his head, that is probably when he was measured. And he is measured by David. David is a teenager. He is not full grown. And the cubit is between the elbow and the end of the finger. So David's cubit would not be nearly as long as anybody else. So if Saul is 7 feet tall, he would be a giant. And so we have this battle that takes place, and David hears him challenging the Israelites and says that he is ridiculing God, and they shouldn't stand for this. Well, David is taken to Saul, and David says he will go and fight him. Saul puts a coat of armor on him, but David can't move. It was too much for him, so he takes it off. And then David uses what he is used to, and that is his slingshot and sling stones. Now, the sling stone is about the size of the fist. It's not a tiny little pebble. And he picks up 5 of these from the brook and goes out to meet Goliath. They challenge one another. They say bad things against one another. And David tells him that he is going to kill him. In chapter 17 and verse 41, meanwhile the Philistine, with his shield bearer in front of him, kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was only a boy, ruddy and handsome, and he despised him. He said to David, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. "Come here," he said, "and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." Now, in these battles, you always make some kind of statement before you engage in combat. So this is his statement, what he's going to do to David. And then David in verse 45 says, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will hand you over to me, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head." And this is what happens. David ran towards him. He had a sling stone in his sling, and it hit Goliath, probably in the temple, although there are some who think there was someplace else that it hit him. But it was enough to stun him and knock him down, whether he is actually killed by the stone or not. Then David runs up to him, takes out Goliath's own sword, and cuts off his head. And then David takes the head back with him and takes it to Jerusalem. And the sword ends up in the sanctuary. When Saul realizes what David has done, he wants to know who's his father, because he wants to know, are there other heroes like this in the family of David? David is then introduced to Saul. Now, we have a difficulty because Saul has had David play his lyre in his home when an evil spirit came on him. So we would think that he had come to know who he was. And there's a little difficulty with the chronology in this particular section. But David now becomes the hero. And Saul is happy that he has killed Goliath. But then when he hears the women singing, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands, Saul becomes very jealous of David. And this is one of the reasons why he attempts to kill him so many times. He is jealous of what he has done. And we see now in the rest of the book of 1 Samuel that Saul many times tries to kill David.